Welcome, everybody. We are going to start this evening with a presentation by a panel of experts, and it is my great and distinct pleasure to introduce the person who will introduce you to that panel. His name is Gabriel Saya. He is the head of policy and organizing for the Drug Policy Alliance. He has been active in this state year in and year out to change our crazy policies on drug addiction, was very, very instrumental in the reform of the Rockefeller drug law, is looking to work on medical marijuana, and is more conscious than anyone else of the need to change our criminal justice policy into a public health policy. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Gabriel.
My name is Gabriel Saya, and I am the State Director for the Drug Policy Alliance. Just briefly about who we are. The Drug Policy Alliance is a national organization of people who believe that the war on drugs is doing more harm than good. We're based out of Manhattan. I live in Brooklyn. We're a national organization with offices in New Mexico, New Jersey, Colorado, and DC, and California. We work on issues such as sentencing reform and overdose prevention, youth drug education programs, and increasing access to treatment. We're not a service organization. We do all policy advocacy. And so I work with a great team of people here in New York on trying to change our drug laws in the state of New York so that we have a health-based approach instead of a criminal justice-oriented approach. And some of the folks here in the room I've had the pleasure of working with, like Judith Brink in the Prison Action Network, Reverend Hartwell here, who has done a lot of work on these issues for a very, very long time, Bill Bastick with It Could Happen to You, and his crew have been doing a lot of work on sentencing reform issues. I feel real honored to have been invited to be here with you all today and for the conference this weekend. Let me just give you a brief rundown of what you can expect with the evening program. We're going to open up with a plenary discussion here. I think we have Judge Keefe. Is he here? Is the judge here? Hi, Judge. And Professor John Ostwald. Hey, Professor, welcome. Is Paul Henderson here? Hey, Mr. Henderson, hello. So we're going to have a really rich panel discussion. I think and Kate is going to join that as well. My role here is really just to keep that part moving along. I'm going to ask some questions at the end. Each of the presenters will be up and present in front of the room here for 8 to 10 minutes. We're going to open it up at the end for Q&A for you to ask the presenters questions, including Dr. Tick after his keynote speech. I got a call from Frank Zaro back in January inviting me to be here, and I said, well, I hadn't heard of the organization, and I said, well, what are y'all trying to do? And he explained to me that he was part of a group of people that was working to try to raise awareness around the issues of the intersection of vets and mass incarceration. And he said, and this year we're going to be talking about drugs and drug policy and whatnot. We'd like you to come and speak. And I was honored to be invited, and I spent some time talking to my colleagues about this issue because we issued a report earlier this year, or at the end of last year, about veterans in the criminal justice system, particularly in relation to drug crimes, but in a broad sense what was happening with vets in the criminal justice system. And the report was called Healing a Broken System. And one of the things that we found in the report was that of the 2.5 million people, men and women who are serving the country now in Iraq and Afghanistan, who are coming home, many of whom are coming back into communities that don't have jobs for them or don't have proper services. And the single most significant indicator of whether or not a vet is going to be involved in the criminal justice system is substance abuse and addiction. And in the absence of having a wholesale system to address the concerns and needs of veterans and their families, what we see is an uptick in the involvement of veterans in the criminal justice system. That's a problem unto itself. But then the system, as it currently is constructed, is problematic and broken in a variety of ways. The criminal justice system is not designed to provide healing and support, and yet for the last 40 years, under the nation's war on drugs, it has been the primary mechanism through which we have dealt with drug abuse and addiction. And in fact, it was 40 years ago, just this month, in New York State, that Governor Nelson Rockefeller signed the Rockefeller drug laws. That was May 8, 1973. When Nelson Rockefeller signed those laws, he had a couple of interesting things to say, and one of them was that treatment doesn't work. We need to get tough. It's time to increase penalties. It's time to show the drug dealers and the users that we're serious. That's why we're going to implement sentences of 15 years to life for even first-time drug offenses, and that was in 1973. And that was a period that the nation had just declared a war on drugs, but it wasn't really until that time that Nelson Rockefeller signed that law into being that we had an architecture for what that war was going to look like. The Rockefeller drug laws became the model for the war on drugs across the country. And 40 years later, even though those laws have been reformed, in part because of folks like Reverend Hartwell and others who spent many, many years speaking out against them, we are still in the mindset, in the paradigm of a criminal justice-oriented approach, where in many cases the only way that someone can get access to treatment and services is through the criminal justice system. When you have folks like Judge Keefe and others who have done a good job from their position inside of that system to try to provide services as they can, we've been able to develop a lot of resources like drug courts or veteran courts, the first in the country that started in Buffalo. But we have a long way to go. So they think that the conference here over the course of the next 2.5 days is going to focus on where we are in the current moment, where we can go. I think there's a real rich array of speakers here slated to speak. And so with that, let me introduce Dr. Tick and Kate Dahlstead with Soldier's Heart. And just a brief note, I was sharing with Dr. Tick that the term Soldier's Heart, I said I recognize this because of our research work into PTSD, and Soldier's Heart was a term that they called, what we now call PTSD, they called it that in the Civil War. And then Dr. Tick was saying, well, actually, this has been around for thousands of years, and it's part of the warrior spirit, or the experience of warriors in different cultures have been able to name this, and there's, I think he said, 90 different terms for this. He'll have more to say about this, but just in that small interaction, I was able to learn something, and this is an important issue to me because on a personal level, my grandfathers were both veterans. My stepfather, who I grew up with, was a vet. I am not a vet, but coming from a family of vets and working with vets in the work that I do for advocacy, I feel honored to be here with all of you and grateful for the opportunity to be here, especially in this beautiful retreat center. So with that, we're going to hear from 4 speakers here. We're going to hear from Judge Thomas Keefe, who's with the Albany County Drug Court. We're going to hear from Professor John Ostwald, who's with the Hudson Valley Community College. We're going to hear from Attorney Paul Henderson, who's traveled here, I think, from the West Coast, from Washington State, and from Kate Dahlstead, who's one of the co-directors and founders of Soldier's Heart. They're each going to come up and speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. And then at the end, that's going to take us a little bit past 9, and then I will facilitate a Q&A for those of you who have questions or answers, and we'll have folks sit up here for that, or if you want to ask those 4 speakers or Dr. Tick questions. And then I'm happy to stay here as long as folks want to stay in the room, but as it gets late and you need to go, do your thing, take care of yourselves. There's certainly no club that anybody's going to here down the road, right? Because there was a herd of cows that was blocked my entrance into the place today. It was like the best traffic jam I've been in for a long time. So, which is all to say, I think we're here for the evening. I certainly am. With that, let me invite up here Judge Thomas Keefe, who is the drug court judge here in Albany County. Judge, I'm going to ask you if you'd provide a bit of your bio as part of your speaking, a bit more of background for you. But one thing I would like to note about the judge who I've not yet met personally was just to say, I've been doing work on drug policy issues for a long time. There's a handful of judges and people within the system who get spoken about with some regularity around the state for trying to do the right thing and establishing an environment where folks are doing unique things. There's a lot of drug courts across the country. They all look a little bit different. Some of them run well, some of them don't. But the reputation from the Albany County Drug Court is one that runs well. And so I'd like to invite Judge Keefe to the stage here.
I'm just a little city court judge in the city of Albany, and I run a little city court drug court. Actually, I run what's called a regional drug court because the 21 municipal courts, every municipality in the state of New York, and New York City is different. Outside of New York City, every municipality in the state of New York has a court, villages, towns, and cities. And in those municipal courts, anyone who gets arrested in that jurisdiction for murder or for peeing on the sidewalk comes to that municipal court. The most serious charges, the charges we call felonies, after they get arraigned, they go up to the higher level court, to Judge Herrick's level court, and the non-felonies stay down in the municipal court. So Albany is a small city. We have 3 full-time criminal court judges. I handled about 4,000 cases last year. But remember, the felonies go up after a day, keeping me with misdemeanors and lower than misdemeanors, meaning I don't put people in state prison. If I throw the book at somebody, that's 8 months in the Albany County Jail. That's the maximum penalty I can dish out. So as a way of a little bit of background, drug courts started in about 35, 38 years ago in Dade County, Florida, Miami, Florida. And they were experimental, sort of came up from the streets. We need to do something different. We're sending people to state prison for 20 years and 25 years relative to drug crimes. We got to do something different, and the experiment of drug court started, and it, 38 years, there's not many jurisdictions in the United States that don't have some access to drug courts today. And this system where a person facing 20 years in state prison can enter into a drug treatment program supervised by an intensive supervision involving drugs and prosecutors and other people, and the threat of going to jail for 20 years helps an addicted person work towards conquering their addiction. So that theory has been knocked down to my level court, where the threat of doing 8 months in jail can theoretically help a person fight their addiction. It's a little bit semi-ridiculous in the sense that a person who's addicted to drugs and alcohol, drug courts are not for people who abuse drugs and alcohol, but for addicted to drugs and alcohol, that the threat of going to jail for 8 months is going to really help them break this addiction. There's some evidence that it works, and I see some evidence that it works, but Judge Herrick is in the county court. The threat of going to state prison for 5 years, for 10 years, for 20 years certainly has a little bit more pressure on people. In the 3rd Judicial District that we're sitting in now, it takes in 7 counties. About 2 years ago, the administrative judge, through some pressure from the veterans community, started a vet track program, and they decided to do it through all the drug courts. So all of the drug court judges in the 7 counties in this area of the state of New York have been ordered by the district to do what's called a vet track, and so I'm a drug court judge, and I do a vet track. And having said that, we've been operating a sort of an unofficial, what I'll call vet track protocols in the Albany City Court for many, many years. My fear when the court system decided they were going to do an official program, that they were going to screw it up. And actually, Judge Herrick was the judge who was in charge of creating a framework for the system, and he did an excellent job, and he allowed each individual court to set up their own individual program. So therefore, we were allowed, there was a mechanism where the top-down didn't force us to do crazy things, at least yet. So I just am giving them a certain amount of time for the forces on top to screw things up down at the bottom. Oh, I promise not to speak for 8 to 10 minutes. The interesting thing about a my-level court, 50% or more of the people who come in front of me are facing maximum jail terms of 10 days, 15 days, 30 days, 90 days in jail, right? So, we're not dealing with the most serious issues in the world. However, when I've been there for 10.5 years, the first year I was there, the chief of police in Albany presented to the judges the top 10 list for the past 10 years in the history Albany. He gave us the names of the 10 people arrested in Albany most frequently over the past 10 years. Number 1 on the list had been arrested in the city of Albany 480 times in 10 years. Now, when he provided the list, I assumed, it was the chief of police, by the way, I assumed that it was a mistake, that he had screwed this document up, because nobody can possibly be arrested 480 times in 10 years. And that was just the top of the list. All 10 were over 250 arrests in 10 years. But it was true. Now remember, the top 10 guy, the top number 1 guy had been arrested. Sometimes he was arrested twice in the same day. The vast majority of his arrests were for having open containers of alcohol. But he had been arrested for very serious crimes. He had actually, prior to the 10-year period, he had done several years in state prison. He was effectively a mentally ill person and a street alcoholic combined, and he actually was proud of the fact that he got arrested so much. But the purpose of my story is that I'm a judge in a municipal, in a city, and tremendous numbers of people get arrested over and over and over again. And so whether you're going to state prison for 10 years in one stretch, or you're doing jail time for half of your life at 30 days and 60 days and 6 months, or maybe 2 years in state prison during one of it, it's all sort of, in a certain sense, the same thing. Through the aspects of learning about drug courts are called problem-solving courts, and I guess that means that when you're not dealing with a drug court or a vet track, the opposite of a problem-solving court, I guess, is a problem-causing court. And if you have a court system where one person can be arrested 480 times in 10 years, I think it's a problem-causing court. So anyway, the end of what I'm going to say before I sit down is that it seems to me, I'm very happy to have been signed vet track, because it seems to me our court systems should be problem-solving courts, not problem-causing courts. They are allowing me to treat veterans differently than everybody else except for the severely addicted. I would prefer to be dealing with every defendant in front of me in a problem-solving situation rather than in a problem-causing situation, but I'm certainly allowed to do it for veterans. We've expanded, you know, the beginning of this presentation, not my presentation, but we've expanded, the vet track that I run takes in any veteran. All they have to do is say, I'm a veteran and I would like to look at this vet track, and it doesn't matter what their charge is, it doesn't matter whether they're a dishonorably discharged veteran, it doesn't matter what country they're a veteran of. And also we've sort of expanded it to the children of veterans and the spouses of veterans, and we've gotten away with it so far, and so I'm hoping to expand that so we can do what we did this morning. Was your father a veteran? Was your next door neighbor a veteran? And we can take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. I had some odd thoughts while sitting there. Some of my thinking was, where were the vets in my career from 1975 to about 1992? I want to go over that briefly and then go up to 1992. I got out of the service, got my first degree, and got my first job was in Schenectady, New York, at a drug treatment program called Bridge Center. And we did have a few vets, and my immature thinking at the time was, these guys are nuts just like the rest of the drug abusers we're dealing with. I could see no difference at the time, 1975. In the 80s, when I moved to New York City, I worked for Daytop Village, one of the larger programs in the world. And still, I didn't seem to see too many vets at Daytop Village. But during the 80s, I'll ask you, what got the most attention in the early 80s? What is it? The epidemic of AIDS. Got more publicity, more attention. So at that point, the AIDS epidemic was really in the way and got much of the focus. I worked at Kings Park Psychiatric Center on Long Island, and there was a lot of people with schizophrenia. I hadn't noticed any veterans there. I taught at Brooklyn College, College of Staten Island, and Nassau Community College, still no vets. And it just came to me while I was sitting there, and even peer vets, you know, friends I would have as vets, they didn't want to be seen. That's why they seemed to be invisible. They, like me, came home and felt the same, same stigma, the same discomfort. Didn't want to be identified as all those nasty terms that were used during that era. Around 1990, I returned home to upstate New York, and I worked for the Department of Correctional Services. And I was in middle management. I was an administrator in the Drug and Alcohol Division. And still, I didn't seem, again, to notice too many vets. I had a very good job, got the state car, had a nice suit, roamed around to all the prisons. But one thing I did remember when I went on my little field trips to do paperwork in the prisons was, if you're a feeling-oriented person, when you're in a building or a special place, you're feeling it, you're really noticing it. What I felt profoundly was despair, hopelessness, and anger as I walked through the tiers of many famous and not so famous prisons in New York State. Around 1992, I got a job at Hudson Valley Community College in Troy, New York, and I teach there full-time. I teach all kinds of psychology courses. I'm currently the faculty advisor to the Armed Forces Club. We have a lot of vets at Hudson Valley Community College. We have at least 350. Our club provides various activities. We've had Ed speak there a few times. We have various ceremonies on Veterans Day. And I'm on kind of a road trip with the school. I go and lecture at national conferences on the topic Veterans on Campus. Like many teachers, I have part-time jobs. I volunteer for Soldiers' Hearts. It's not a job. I don't get paid. I'm a volunteer there. And I really don't look at it like a job. I really enjoy it. I'm kind of mercenary, too. I really don't like to do things unless I'm getting something back. And through Soldiers' Heart in the last 5 years, I've learned a tremendous amount about veterans' issues. I thought I knew a lot about PTSD and related disorders because I teach psychology, abnormal, developmental, etc. But I went to Vietnam with Kate and Ed and other people on a journey of reconciliation and healing, and there was a whole new dimension that was revealed to me. I'm very grateful to you for that. For about a year and a half, I and a co-facilitator ran a war healing circle in Albany, New York. It wasn't made for TV stuff. It was real stuff, profound stuff. A cathartic experience for vets. No counseling, no advising, just kind of putting it out, which has profound value. Mr. Amadon over there, John Amadon, sat next to me for about a year and a half, and I'll always remember that and his support during that period. Also for Soldiers' Heart, I've done presentations, recently in Columbia County, just south of us, where I had to attempt to explain to judges and the district attorney and other attorneys something that seems simplistic to many of you, why veterans are different than civilians and why they should get special treatment in the courts. I also have presented in Florida for Ed's dad and a group of World War II vets. My part-time job that I get paid for is as a columnist for the Record newspaper in Troy. I've been doing that for 10 years. I'm one of the luckiest writers around. Any writers here? I can write about whatever I want in my column. I've written about sexuality, drugs, gambling, the devil, God, death, vacations, dating, love, romance. I've written about 20 columns on veterans-related issues. I wrote about the trip my mother and I had with the Patriot flight. I've written about 4 columns on our Vietnam trip. And one of my columns is over there on the table. It's called The Sentencing of a Marine. And Ed didn't mention the name specifically, but it was about a young Marine who was sentenced to, I think, 3 years in federal prison for sale of weapons. And I was stunned in the courtroom when, after all of Ed's testimony was revealed, it seemed to be completely ignored. I was also stunned by a naive statement by the prosecutor who said that there is treatment for this young man when he goes to prison for his PTSD. Absolutely stunned. And my students said to me later, they thought the whole thing was rather bizarre. What about the compassion? What about the understanding for the young vet? So please take a copy of that if you get a chance. One of my other part-time jobs is I do periodic training for drug and alcohol counselors in Albany. These are people studying for their KSAT, which is the certification. I designed brief trainings, 4 or 8-hour trainings on topics like sexuality and chemical dependency, depression and suicide, body image issues, and counselor effectiveness. About 2 years ago, they asked me to design some veterans-oriented trainings, and I designed what I called Back to the World, simply adjusting to coming back to the world, to general society. I also designed a training called Signature Wounds. So my background working with vets is rather diverse at the college campus, in the drug abuse field, through my newspaper column. What I've learned a lot of things, but what I've learned maybe in the last 2 years, 3 years, is that the vets that I've worked with are extremely resistant to seeking all the help that is available for them. They're very creative in being resistant. Sometimes they abuse drugs. Sometimes they are enamored so much with the technology, they withdraw into it and really don't deal with the outside world too much. That disturbs me and saddens me because I'm trying to engage them and get them hooked up with all these things I see in the community. But I realize that it's a challenge to me and others, that I have to be creative. I have to be innovative. I can't go by the rule books, all the junk I've read in my psychology text. I have to come up with new ways, whether it's providing some event at school that has food, which usually attracts a lot of people. At school, we had a dodgeball tournament, and we got a ton of vets for that, involved in that. Maybe they like the combative nature of it. At our meetings, we get maybe 20 vets. At that event, we had 130. So that's a challenge to me. As I said again, I'm a little bit mercenary. I don't like to do things for nothing. Somebody told me a long time ago, you don't have to be a martyr to go to heaven. I'm not a martyr. So again, what I've gotten out of this work with vets is I've met some magnificent, wonderful, and courageous people. Not just vets, people working with vets. Again, Kate and Ed and others, people I've met here, John Amadon. I've really benefited by their friendship. And their courage has spilled over into me. I'm feeling a little more courageous lately and more powerful. And I feel like I can be a change agent despite the complexity and the difficulty of working with vets and their family in our society. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be here. I entered the Army in 1968, and I left the Army in 1996. It's 28 years. I spent 23 of those years in the military. Was with the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam in 1969, 1970. I was wounded, medevaced out, sent home. In my career in the Army, I spent 11 years in Special Forces, where I was deployed many spots in the world, but mostly in Asia, back to Southeast Asia, into Northeast Asia, Japan, Thailand, Korea. And then I spent some time in some other units, and I retired out of the military in 1996. Because I did a lot of time in the reserve units, I was able to pursue a dual track. And I was also a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for over 30 years. And as a lawyer, I have been a criminal defense attorney. I've been a prosecutor. I've been in the civil side, worked for insurance companies, and I've worked as a plaintiff's lawyer against insurance companies and government organizations and that sort of thing. I've been a judge pro tem. But perhaps the biggest thing that I can offer you in this conference from my own experience is, first of all, my experience as a veteran and someone who had to come to grips over 20 years after I came home. I had the problems when I first came home, but over 20 years after I came home of where the psychic wounds came back, and in a big way. And it was somewhat of a progressive process over about 2 or 3 years, but in that period of time, things went downhill for me in a very dramatic way, very serious way, that was aggravated by alcohol, and lots of alcohol, to where I was circling the drain. And as a result, I wound up as not only all those things I've talked about, but also as a criminal defendant and in the system. And eventually, a consumer of corrective services. I went to jail over my conduct. So it has been a long road back. That was about 17 years ago when this happened. And as the judge pointed out, there's a great deal of incentive about going to jail and what it can do for you. They say some people get into recovery because they see the light, and others because they feel the heat. And I was certainly in the latter category. But whatever the motivation, it worked. And I'm going to talk a lot about this on Sunday and give you some more information about that, that experience and the lessons that I've taken from it, and perhaps what I can pass on. Since the time that that has happened and I put that behind me, I got involved with doing some veterans work, beginning with this veteran. And one of the things that I can tell you from my perspective, and for those of you who have worked with veterans, particularly combat veterans, and this was certainly my experience too, is that it is often very difficult. It was extraordinarily difficult for me to get to the point of saying, yes, I have a wound. Yes, this really affected me. Those experiences that transformed me did it in a way that I can't control. I mean, I was a Green Beret lieutenant colonel. You can't tell me I got psychic problems from being in combat. Yeah, that just didn't fit the mold. But it was the truth. And since then, and since working with that and embracing that, and going through the system that now treats veterans by saying, there's something wrong with you, you have an anxiety disorder, we're going to classify you as a percentage less than a total human being, Gesundheit. And then we're going to treat you with drugs so that you can get to normative behavior. And that means you can act as though this experience never happened. That is a system, and I went through that, and I believed it. And I got to where I could get to normative behavior for the most part. But then I read Ed Tick's book, and I discovered that my experience was not unique to the war in Vietnam, or unique to Iraq or Afghanistan, or it was unique to warriors since recorded history and probably before. And that I was part of that tradition, and there was a method of dealing with those wounds that was far more effective than what we're doing now through the medical system. We've turned this over to medicine, and they've used their approach. And since then, it went from I can control symptoms to where I can be a different person, to where I can be the wounded healer. And I've been doing work with veterans groups, with individual veterans since then, and through Soldier's Heart, and based upon the principles that Ed put in his book. So it has been a long road for me, but let me end this up by, I was in Africa recently, and I'd read about this before, but I wanted to observe it firsthand, and I did. And there are troops of baboons there that will operate anywhere from 20 to 200 animals. And they are very social. And they have a real hierarchy and pecking order within the troop, people who are in charge, and they move around and they do what they're going to do. They groom each other, they breed, they feed, they do all those sorts of things these social animals do. And every time they stop, they take adolescent males and they put them out on the perimeter. And they'll be about 30 yards or so out, depending upon the terrain, depending upon vegetation. And their job is to stand as sentries. And when the predators come, when the leopard comes, when the lion comes, when the wild dogs come, this young trooper's job is to keep that predator at bay and long enough so that the rest of the troop can get away. And I have a picture of this if anybody wants to see it. It came from Life magazine about 40 or 50 years ago of this young baboon who's haunched back like this, facing a leopard who is putting on the brakes and the dust is flying. And it's an incredibly dramatic picture. Now, not all of these young baboons make it, but the ones who do come back into the troop, and they are placed into ever-increasing positions of responsibility, and they eventually become the elders in the troop. And they do this because they put themselves out there on the line. And they said that they would sacrifice their own lives, if necessary, in order to benefit and protect that troop. And that's how that works, and it works very well. Now, I want you to imagine that instead of that process happening, that when the young baboon comes back into the troop, people say, "You're weird. We don't know how to deal with you. Why don't you just disappear?" Or, "You got a problem, we know how to fix it. Take these drugs, and we'll classify you as less than a total baboon." So how well do you think the troops would be doing if they were using that kind of process? And that's what we're doing. And it's not working very well. And there are some other methods that can work, and there's some methods that can work, I think, as it flows into the criminal justice system, as many of us come in. I have to tell you, when I became a lawyer, I said, because when I first came back, I gotta tell you, when I first came back to Vietnam, I spent about 2-3 years out in Idaho in the middle of nowhere, drinking and taking every drug I could get my hands on. I think the statute of limitations is gone. And then when I became a lawyer, I said, you know, I can't take drugs anymore because I'll lose my license and go to jail. I'll just drink. Well, guess what? I lost my license and went to jail. It's all back now, but anyway. Like I say, I will share more about that story on Sunday morning. Thank you very much.
As Mr. Henderson was talking, I was just thinking about the experience of people who I know who have come home from prison who get treated in the same way that you just characterized. You're weird. I don't know what to do with you here. I don't understand you. And I'm just, as this discussions have gone on this evening, I'm just struck at the similarities of some of these conversations, not to take anything away from the warrior identity of veterans and soldiers, but the experience of coming back from something that transforms a human being and not being received in a manner that is honors and respects and makes visible that transformation does seem to be very parallel or connected here. And I can only imagine that's got to be even more the case for veterans who come home from the criminal justice system after incarceration, because certainly people I love who have come home from prison, and certainly probably some of the folks that you all have worked with, do come back into a society that does not welcome them, come back into an environment that does not make it easy in any way to reintegrate, and certainly does not honor people for the fact that the mere fact that a human being can come home after being put in a cage for so long is itself a small miracle. And if they can hold themselves intact during that period of incarceration, that is a small miracle that I'm sure probably in some form or fashion is rooted back in the same type of warrior spirit that folks have discussed this evening. So these are just some of the things that have come up for me this evening. But we have our last speaker is the co-founder of Soldier's Heart, Kate Dahlstedt. I'm going to invite her up to the podium. We opened up with their discussion and prayer, which I deeply appreciated, and now we'll wrap this up with your comments. Kate?
As the co-director of Soldier's Heart, and over the last 25 years, I have had the honor and the blessing of working with many of our nation's veterans who I consider to be some of the finest human beings on earth. And that has been a real privilege for me. But in recent years, I've been the director of our Women and War Project at Soldier's Heart. And so I've begun working with family members of veterans, and primarily with women family members. And as I've been doing that work, some interesting themes have come up. And the interesting thing about them is that many of the experiences and feelings that family members have been sharing with me are very similar to the kinds of experiences that our veterans talk about. What the women on my weekly support group have been telling me is that they feel really isolated from the rest of the culture, just like our veterans say, right? They feel invisible. And today's Army is made up of over 50% National Guard and reserves. So these are not people who are living on bases. These are people who are living in our communities. So they could be a bank teller. They could be the checkout girl at your grocery store. They could be your librarian. They could be the person who sits next to you in church. But you may not know that they have a family member who's in harm's way. And that's one of the ways that they're invisible. What they say is sometimes they are afraid or uncomfortable to share that they have a family member who's in the military, because they may live in an area where most people don't believe in war, are anti-war, or protesters and that kind of thing, and they confuse our wars with the people who are in the military. And so they are embarrassed to say that they have a loved one there for fear that there will be some kind of negativity expressed about that, and that they won't get support. Well, they don't get support, that's the problem, because most people have no idea what our family members are going through. They don't understand. And even if they do know that you have a family member who's serving, they don't really show a lot of interest or concern. So these women have said to me is they'd rather not tell anybody than to feel the hurt of telling somebody and not having anybody care or want to understand or want to spend time talking to them about it. And just like our vets who come home and are changed forever, our family members feel the same way. In a way, they're serving too, and they feel like their lives have been changed forever. We talk about the complex emotions that go along with the deployment cycle. And when you know that somebody has a family member who's serving, what they're going through might very much be impacted by where in that cycle they are. So first there's enlistment. And sometimes families have long conversations about the enlistment and whether it's a good idea or not a good idea and so on. But sometimes not. And sometimes family members come home and announce that they have enlisted. And sometimes they're supported by their families for that. And sometimes they're not. And sometimes their families are very upset and angry that they did that without discussing it. And family members do not agree that it was a good decision. Then there's basic training, and the family begins to fragment, and the loved one leaves home and has an experience that the rest of the family doesn't quite understand or know about. And sometimes when people are in basic training, they're not allowed to contact family or friends for long periods of time. So their family doesn't even know what they're going through, what's happening. Then you have that time, that really very, very hard time before deployment, pre-deployment, when family members are rearranging who's going to do what and how they're going to make a living, because oftentimes if they're reserves or National Guard, the people who are going off into the military to serve overseas have to give up their jobs. So now this family doesn't have the same income anymore. So they have to make a lot of adjustments for that. Maybe the wife who is staying home with the kids now has to take a job. All the roles get all changed because everything has to get done, even though the family member is not going to be there for a long time. Then you have the family members who really are very anxious, of course, and worried about their family member who's going off. But those last few weeks, when deployment is imminent, what they want more than anything is to be close to their loved one. They want to spend as much time as possible. They know that this may be the last time. It may be the last time they can have that conversation. It can be the last time that they can give that person a kiss. It may be the last time a husband can smell his wife. And so they want to be close. But the person who's leaving and getting ready to deploy needs to be withdrawing, needs to be getting focused, needs to become part of that military machine and pull away from being that family member. And so this can begin to create a whole lot of conflict. And then there's deployment. And what families go through during deployment, worried every day and not hearing. And of course today, unlike other wars, we have so much good technology, which is a blessing and a curse, because now we can have contact with each other 24/7. We have cell phone contact, we have computer contact, but sometimes people are out on missions for long periods of time and they can't make that regular phone call or that regular email, and family members don't know what to make of that. We also have 24-hour news. So family members sometimes are up, till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning because they know that something's been going on somewhere overseas, and they want to know where it was, what unit was involved, and was it their loved one. So these are the kinds of things they're living with every day. And we get up in the morning and we talk to our coworkers and we have no idea that they were up at 3 o'clock in the morning watching the news, trying to find out if their loved one is still alive. And then there's homecoming. And everybody's waiting for homecoming. And our troops can't wait to get home, and the family members can't wait to have them come home. And everybody's hoping that everything's going to go back to the way it was. But as we said, everybody's changed. Everybody's changed forever. And so that process gets very complicated as well. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that right now. But certainly for married couples, the roles have all been reversed. Sometimes people will say they come home and they feel like they're not needed anymore because everything's running smoothly without them, and they don't know how to fit themselves back into that. And so we have married couples who have gone through a very intense experience, each in their own way, and when they're hoping that with homecoming, that their loved one is going to come home and they're going to understand everything they've been through, but they can't because they're all in different places. And so that leads sometimes to, obviously, divorce, because the divorce rates are very high, but also things like domestic violence and substance abuse. One of the women that I've been working with has a son who's a helicopter pilot. He's an instructor, too, actually. But he's in a very high-risk position. He's had 4 deployments. And in 4 deployments, he's been married 3 times and divorced 3 times. And while he was in the middle of one of those divorces and he was still legally married, he was also homeless. This is an active duty military man, 36 years old. He was homeless because he was getting ready for deployment. He closed up his apartment, put all his things in storage, and then the deployment was delayed. Now, you'd think he'd be able to go to a barrack somewhere, but because his wife that he was divorcing was 3 states away, they said he's a married man and he couldn't be living in the barracks. So he was homeless for several months. He lived in his car. Then he lived in a motel and ran up his credit card bills, and his sister and his mother ran up their credit card bills so that he would have a place to stay and have a roof over his head. When he's not deployed or getting ready for deployment, he abuses alcohol and energy drinks. That's the new thing, is the energy drinks. He's also addicted to intense sports. He has little communication with his family. They're really delighted if they get a 3-sentence email from him, or a 5-minute phone call is heaven. And this is also very typical. And now he is facing his 5th deployment. And this mother and this sister have been through it all for 13 years. They've been through it all the marriages, all the divorces. And one day, the sister looked at the mother and said, "I guess he's ours forever. He's ours forever." And all of these things that I'm talking about are not significantly different in some ways from what it's like for incarcerated vets, and what incarceration and family members of incarcerated vets and what they go through. The feelings of isolation, of being shunned by others, people who don't understand or don't care, the complex emotions that go into that. So after feeling betrayed by our military and by our society, our veterans and their family members feel betrayed by the judicial system. And I'm hoping that this weekend we'll be able to shed some light on how we can help not only our veterans, but all of the people that are involved and all of the family members that are impacted by incarceration. So I'm really glad that you're all here. Thank you. I'm looking forward to tomorrow.